You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the...
Hello,
Wow.
hello.
Welcome to, I think, the 6th episode, Martin, of It's
Number 6, not number
Your
1.
Time You're Wasting. Martin, you're looking pretty smart. Not less smart than last week, but pretty smart. I've smartened up a little bit in order to compete with your smartness level of last week, and now I feel overdressed. So,
Well, I have to dress down in order to help you dress up, so to speak.
Thank you. Well, somewhere, sooner or later, we'll meet in the middle. And I've got our alternative show sponsors that caused us to be banned a few episodes ago on my shirt. So I don't know if that will cause us to be banned as well. But
The Ramones.
How the hell are you?
I think I'm well. I've had a quite a busy week, shall we say? A busy week, and doing lots of things. How about you? Because you're teaching, aren't you?
Yeah, very busy week. So Tuesday, for instance, I spent the whole day doing cover. So that was fun, and but it got better from there. And I am teaching, but I'm only part-time. So today I've been just footling around in my office and basically sighing with relief that the hard work of the week is over. And so I get it a day earlier than most teachers, but still
so
feel.
What's in today's show? I think we ought to tell them. So do you want to?
We have got. I did an interview in the week with Claire Stoneman and the other people involved in the executive leadership program. But there's some Martin, you'll never guess this. There's some slight difficulty with it being uploaded and got ready. So we're going to have to ramble a bit because that was meant to start.
Happy. What else? I've got an interview coming up with. I was going to say television's Phil Beadle, but he was an edu celebrity before there was such a thing as edu celebrity.
Back before Twitter. Yes,
that's it. He's a proper edu celebrity.
Teachers TV, wasn't he? Teachers
TV, that's right, yeah. and the Guardian, I believe, as well. He
had a Guardian column, and yeah, he was your go-to edu celeb back in the day, and now, of course, you can't move for edu celebs.
No, and is that a good thing? Well, I
love it.
It's releasing the teacher's voice, perhaps, into the mainstream.
It's something along those lines, isn't it? So, what's Phil talking about?
Phil's talking about his new book, which is cryptically called That Fascist Painting, but it's a look at cultural capital through the lens, perhaps, of Pierre Bourdieu. So he'll talk about that.
Controversial stuff?
Some of it might be, and certainly if it's not the full interview will be controversial, but certainly there are aspects of it that some people might find controversial and others might be sort of cheering from the rafters and the barricade, shall we say. So that'll be something for people to look forward to when we release the full interview in the week. So please subscribe to make sure you don't miss that.
We've got some copies of Phil's book to give away as well, haven't we?
Yeah, that'll be next week. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Because we're giving away what are we giving away this week? We're giving away.
It's a bonanza this week. We're giving away copies of Ed Hirsch's book. We released the full interview during the week of E.D. Hirsch and ourselves talking about culture and citizenship. And we also have copies of Mary Myatt's book, Back on Track, to give away.
So how do you get to be part of the raffle? Well, you have to subscribe to the channel. If you subscribe to the channel, you get put in my hat.
So if you fancy a copy of Phil's book, subscribe and we'll put you in Martin's hat, and we might pull you out of Martin's hat as well. So you never know. You never know your luck.
What's the last interview we've got today?
The last interview is with Sarah Dove, who has various prominent roles. I can't remember all the list of organisations she's involved with, but she's going to be talking about mental well-being, mental health, and that sort of thing, and her take on that. And then we're also going to have we'll also probably do a bit of a COVID update, won't we? And see
We'll
where
do a bit of a COVID update and perhaps look at an article by Simon Jenkins in today's Guardian.
Everybody's favourite journalist.
There we go.
Right. Well, I think we're ready to play the interview with Claire Stoneman et al. So have a look at this, Martin. See what you think of this exceptional leadership programme. So I'm really excited to welcome to the studio Clive Wright, Annie Carter and Claire Stoneman, the brains behind a new leadership programme which has some funding from the DfE. It's called ELP. Clive, can you tell me what ELP means and where the genesis for it came from?
Right, well, the ELP is the Exceptional Leadership Programme, and as you say, it was DfE funded, but we were given quite a broad remit to create a sort of course that we thought would be exciting in terms of leadership development. So we had, Claire and I got together with Annie quite early on in the process, and our vision was, how do you as a leader, you're a school leader, and you have an aspiration to be really impactful in terms of the influence you have over your school community, and you really want to have an influence that transforms lives. This moral mission that we're all on as educators. And the thing that I think we've discovered is that when you go out and you see amazing schools, or when you go out and you talk to extraordinary leaders, how do you sort of distill what they've discovered down into something that is usable in your own context? So as school leaders, we do our own thing, and we try to be the best we can in our own context, but we want to be more than that. And what we found was, through things like obviously research ed and going and visiting some exciting schools, that there were particular traits and particular approaches to educating young people that we wanted to be able to share in a more formal way. So this is where we began the leadership program. So it's about trying to create a leadership program that's very practical and enables leaders, novice leaders and experienced leaders, to do something hopefully quite extraordinary in their own context.
Thanks. So Annie, let me go to you. So why might school leaders need your program? What makes your program special?
Well, I think it's an opportunity really to share some great practice with some of our colleagues, and about how to implement fantastic behaviour, how to develop a knowledge-rich curriculum. And I think one of the best things about this programme is, not only are you going to get to go and visit some excellent schools where you can see this firsthand, we've also got tutors delivering who have some expertise in school leadership, in inner city schools, in rural schools, and in coastal schools. So
I've heard of some of the tutors that you're going to be using. Can you spill the beans on who you've got?
I certainly can. So we've got people like Tom Bennett, who are going to be providing some great stuff on behaviour. We've got Tom Sherrington, we've got Ruth Ashby and Stuart Locke. And some really fantastic experts in education who will be able to give us that theory and all of their wisdom, and then of course you get to go and have a look in practice what it's like.
Great. Claire, can you add anything to that?
I think really, David, just thinking about, there's such an appetite really for a school leadership programme that focuses very much solely on the domains of curriculum and behaviour. And actually what we mean by that, because we talk about, you hear curriculum bandied about a lot in schools at the minute, but what do we actually mean when we talk about it? What does that look like? So I love that schools are talking about curriculum a lot. I think that's great, and the substance of what we teach, and that's a wonderful thing. And Mary Meyer, I think she talked on this programme last week about the kind of how we're in a really good, intellectually stimulating place within education at the minute, and I agree with her. I agree with her, but kind of to a point. I think there's a caveat with that, really, because thinking's really hard. Thinking's like super difficult, and it's really hard when you're in a busy school and there's lots of different things going on as a school leader. So I think our programme will kind of carve out a space for school leaders to really think properly and well about curriculum and behaviour, because thinking about curriculum's hard. That's the great thing about it. It is delicious but ferocious in its complexity. I think that's the lovely thing about it. You've got to kind of come to curriculum ready to wrestle with it and to think really hard. And as Annie said, the experts that we've got on this programme, it's not just talking about what it might look like, it's going in to see that in schools and see it firsthand in some of the country's most fantastic schools, talking to those expert school leaders and learning from them in context.
Great. So I recognise that we haven't really got around to introducing you all yet. So that if viewers are not sure who you all are, Claire, you're the what's your role in the programme? You've got a quite fancy title, haven't you?
Well, I'm the director of the Exemplary Leadership Programme, which sounds very exciting. But essentially, I coordinate the programme, co-write parts of the programme with our expert tutors, and organise the delivery of it and how that works across a group of schools, and the schools within our trust and the expert tutors across the programme as well.
Okay, and what's your role, Clive? What's
well, I'm a head teacher in the school in Leicestershire, in just outside Hinckley, St Martin's, and I was sort of very keen to get this project when I heard about the sort of funding that was available. So Annie and I are in the same trust. So Annie's, she'll explain in a moment, she's primary, we're secondary, and we've got quite a similar outlook on our sort of educational philosophy with the knowledge rich and the sort of focus on sort of behaviour and culture. So I approached Annie and she was enthusiastic, and then I needed a mastermind, and so we approached Claire. Yeah, exactly. So she sort of joined us, and then we began to sort of put together this programme and put together this bid, and obviously the bids came to fruition. So here we are.
So Annie, as a primary head, do you think you bring an important perspective to a programme like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. You know, I'm head teacher of Christ the King, which, as you say, it's giving that primary perspective, and it's a great opportunity actually to work with a secondary school. And you often find that, you know, when you talk about leadership, there are, you know, the things that make a great leader in a primary are very similar to what make a great leader in a secondary, you know, and I think, you know, you find you have this overlap. You know, in our school, you know, we've defined and articulated the values that we really want our pupils to learn as they journey through the school. Now, I can't imagine that some of those are going to be very different from a primary setting to a secondary setting. And, you know, we've dedicated substantial time to teaching in meticulous detail the behaviours and the routines that we want to become a habit for our children in school. And the reason that we do that is because we know that we get the behaviour right that enables the children to be successful, not just in our school, of course, but also in life. So I think, you know, and again with our curriculum, you know, we believe that a knowledge-led curriculum is a prerequisite for sustained and long-term academic development. And we've taken considerable time to make sure that we've identified that key knowledge that children need to acquire, you know, by the end of each year. And very like a secondary school, you know, that's been done on a subject by subject basis. You know, the subjects are taught discreetly to ensure that the pupils gain that breadth of knowledge. And I think it's that contributes to the very high academic achievement of our children, certainly at the end of Key Stage 2. So I think, you know, that focus on your curriculum, the focus on knowledge, and, you know, the focus on behaviour, and having passionate subject leaders who, you know, really drive their subjects and, you know, look at research into their subjects. is the same for primary and secondary. But I think it's good to have both schools so that, you know, we can showcase, you know, some of the great approaches that we've taken and the journeys that we've been on through that development.
Great, thanks for that. That's great. So it's interesting to hear you all talk, because the program is essentially about helping schools and school leaders think about curriculum. But you've all talked about behaviour. You mentioned the fact that Tom Bennett, the behaviour guru himself, is involved, and it's the first part of your course. Why the emphasis on behaviour for a course that's supposed to be about curriculum?
Well, I mean, what we found, at St Martin's, we've obviously developed lots of these ideas ourselves, but we've also had opportunities. We set up this organisation called the Midland Knowledge Schools Hub. So we've worked with lots of other schools sort of across the Midlands, and we've seen patterns that are very interesting. And one of the things that we've learned is that immaculate behaviour is a prerequisite to a really demanding curriculum. So, for example, in St Martin's, our English curriculum, in year 7 they study Ovid and Metamorphosis, and they study Homer, and they study rhetoric, and they study Beowulf, and it's not just a sort of a light touch version of it. It's an in-depth study of those texts. And if you're spending an hour with in-depth research and in-depth reading and in-depth analysis of what are pretty tough texts, you need children who are completely focused. So whether they're top set or whether they're sort of lower ability children, they need absolute focus. Therefore, if you have any sort of disruption, that's going to completely hamper the delivery of that curriculum.
Okay. So let me ask you a question, Claire. So the curriculum that Clive just given a taste of there might be some people who say that that's maybe a bit elitist or not maybe appropriate for a fast changing modern world for young people to be learning about. What would you say to those sorts of critics?
I think even the discussions and the debates in schools about the substance of curriculum are really important. With our programme that we're offering, it's not a drag and drop model. So we're not saying you have to use the curriculum that's at St Martin's or you must use the curriculum at Christ the King. What we're trying to do is open up the space for debate and discussion about the substance of what's important on the curriculum, and for those debates to be had. At Clive School, they've decided that Ovid's really important to study, and great, like they think that's really important, fantastic. There may well be other schools that think, well, we're not going to have Ovid, we're going to have, I don't know, we're going to do much more of an in-depth study of Old English, Beowulf, and then move into Middle English and Chaucer, but we're not going to do some of the much earlier stuff. I think the programme opens up the space for debate. It really enables school leaders to think in a way that perhaps they haven't done so before, about how curriculum can liberate, and not just the opportunities for our children, but for our colleagues as well. So thinking about the substance of what we teach, not just how we teach it, which in the 20 years I've been in teaching, for much of that time, my time was spent thinking about how I'm going to teach, not necessarily the substance of what I was teaching. And bringing colleagues back to that and how you lead that within a school is a really, really exciting place to be at.
Well, that was a fascinating interview, David. What I particularly liked about it, it was introduced as going to be about Claire Stoneman, and straight away we get Clive Wright there, and then we get Annie Carter. I was thinking, is this the right interview? But of course, Claire turned up there just in time, like the cavalry, and there she was. So it was actually Clive and Annie and Claire. So it was very good. Very good. Can you you raised this in the interview, and it's an interesting point there. The emphasis on curriculum, and then curriculum and behaviour, and one of the words, I think it was Clive or Annie, raised the idea of culture. And would it be better to think about it as curriculum and culture?
Maybe it would, and I think that's certainly what they're getting at. It's just that when you talk about culture, as I think you've pointed out once or twice on this show yourself, Martin, that culture is one of the most complicated words in the English language, and there's a real capacity for misunderstanding. Whereas when you talk about behaviour, people know what you mean, but you're absolutely right. It's thinking about the culture in a school, which will make a really academic curriculum possible to deliver to all kinds of students. And I think the debate has been over the years, that the grammar school provides that kind of curriculum for, the most fortunate, the brightest children, whereas other kinds of children require something else because for all sorts of reasons, they're not capable of accessing it. And maybe, and certainly the argument, I think, behind this this leadership program is that if you get school culture right, then maybe an academic curriculum for all becomes something that's possible.
Yeah, and it was interesting there to hear that about content and the way that content can liberate. And I think Claire was talking about that, but also opening a place for debate and discussion, and not just sort of copying everything and this is the way that do it. Because I remember leadership programs in the past and various leading teacher programs, whether it be AST or whatever, was always about, we practice it the best, we do it best, now do what we do and you'll become brilliant at it. And of course, your environment doesn't necessarily allow that, because everyone has different places in which they work and they have to make it their own.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're completely right. And so finding that path and having those discussions, having that debate is a really, really important part of the process. And in fact, that's perhaps rather a neat segue to your interview with Mr. Beadle, who is coming at the curricular debate from a different angle and has some different points to make, doesn't he?
He does indeed, yes. And I think we might talk about it a bit at the end of the interview, but certainly okay. Culture is his big word. It is.
Let's see if we can go to that interview now.
Now, look, could you hold it up there? Because it's quite a striking image, I think. I can see it looming over your left shoulder. And there it is. Can we see that? The Fascist Painting, it's called. Now, tell me we'll get to the subtitle in a bit, but The Fascist Painting. Now, tell me, why is it called The Fascist Painting?
It was originally, and I think you might recall, it was originally going to be called The Flight from Vulgarity. In cultural capital and Bourdieu, what he identifies is these kind of two polarities in terms of what's legitimate and what's illegitimate. And the illegitimate culturally is described as vulgar, and one might describe the legitimate, and that's in inverted commas, as refined. So it was originally going to be called that. But about halfway through the writing of the book, when we're looking at this idea of culture as man's search for perfection and improvement, I was just kind of fiddling around and I saw a brilliant cover image, which I wanted to use. And it wasn't this. It was a kind of slightly impressionistic watercolor, which I quite liked. And I was going to put that on the front cover. Because what you wouldn't have noticed had I had that on the front cover is in the bottom right-hand corner is a kind of scrawled signature, and the signature is Adolf Hitler. So this notion of culture being man's search for perfection, or a man's path towards being near a god, is kind of somewhat revealed to be nonsense by the fact that Adolf Hitler himself was a really quite competent watercolorist, really not too bad a painter at all. And there was also, the idea of the book is it brings out the political elements of culture and how culture is used to replicate social structures. But there was also a sense that I actually haven't written an education book for half a decade. The last one was How to Teach Literacy. And things have regressed in terms of what we regard as acceptable pedagogy over that time. And to me, I detect a very authoritarian slant with which I'm profoundly uncomfortable. So I felt that the book could also not only be about culture, but could be a kind of freeze frame by which I record, you know, a now relatively ancient guy's views on the progression or regression of pedagogy over the last 5 years. And so the idea of the fascist painting, it's a snapshot at where, there's a snapshot of where I think we are in terms of a profession.
Okay, so I looked at it first, seeing that cover, and I think that would be good in an art gallery, you know, selling there in perhaps the Tate or somewhere like that, where I did notice one of your books before, by the way, in the Tate Gallery bookshop once. Now, Caspar David Friedrich, are you saying that painting by him is a fascist painting?
No, not at all. Not at all. The only, in truth, the reason for the painting, and I sent the publishers a number of options which were, you know, much more appropriate, which were kind of vorticist, futurist paintings. But it was one of the only German paintings that I was aware of. So I'm absolutely not saying that that is a fascist painting, though he did have a fan base amongst fascists. I
think it's a thing of the time, isn't it, that everyone who is sort of German or Germanic culturally was creating art and whatever, and by the time the German Nazis came into power, they were all saying they liked that stuff, but I don't know if they actually did or not. But that's another argument altogether. So your book is also focusing on cultural capital, and what's your book about?
It's basically a response to Ofsted saying that they're going to check up on the provision of cultural capital. And it came about in a very odd way. I was booked to do a speech about it in March for the Hackney Learning Trust. And I'd spent about 14 days on the speech, which is, as you'll know, quite a long time to spend on a speech. And it became immediately apparent that what Ofsted had defined cultural capital is, but with reference to the national curriculum, was actually the opposite of what cultural capital is in terms of, you know, the Bourdieuian idea of it. And what they were doing with it was stripping it out of its meaning and its context so that it could become a metaphor that could mean anything that anybody likes. And so it was clearly an interesting path to go down. I had at the time, you know, I was teaching a couple of days a week at a school in Basildon, and that kind of fell through. And so I just felt it might be a very interesting path to go down. And in doing so, you know, of course, if one examines cultural capital, one would come across Pierre Bourdieu, one would think. and I read quite a lot of Bourdieu. I was very, very lucky in that I chanced upon this brilliant young man called Luc Shoveler, who led me in the direction of places that I should read, other authors that I should read. And so basically, what is the book about? It's a left-wing analysis of the provision of culture in schools, I think, and it's a left-wing analysis of how, you know, that uses Pierre Bourdieu as a lens through which we can see how culture itself is used in the social space to replicate class structures.
Okay, that's very clear. Interestingly, the first quote in your book is from a well-known right-wing thinker, I think, Roger Scruton.
Yes.
So it's not just taken from a limited range of sources. You're obviously looking around and reading around. Is this Luc Shoveler's influence on you, taking you to places you wouldn't ordinarily go, or is this something of your interest to look at culture in the widest sense and then bring it into a more left-wing field, perhaps?
Right. Well, I have no idea who Luc Shoveler is, and I probably mispronounced his name. I do find Roger Scruton fascinating, but that quotation there is deliberately juxtaposed with a quotation from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, because I think the intriguing thing is that H.G. Wells' The Time Machine went forward, and what Roger Scruton seems to have wanted to do, and I find him intellectually a fascinating figure, was to go in the time machine and go backwards. And it's pointing out two polarities of a view of culture. That, you know, Roger Scruton describes culture, a high culture, and he doesn't put inverted commas on it, as the means through which educated people communicate with each other and recognize each other. And I just found that fascinating that he would use the word educated, because the implication there is that if you do not have access to high culture or legitimate culture, then you are therefore not educated, and therefore you're not a voice worthy of listening to. And I juxtaposed it with the Time Machine quote about the Morlock and the Eloi, which kind of tends to suggest that this going back to the past of tradition, what is that likely to cause in future? It's likely to cause more extreme social stratification.
Okay, so if we take that on board, high culture being what Scruton is talking about, an educated person would raise up towards a higher culture, a higher way of talking, a higher way of thinking, all these sorts of things. What do you mean by culture?
Well, you know the Raymond Williams quote that it's one of the 2 or 3 most difficult words in the language. But in a relatively simple way, I tend to view it in the process of writing the book, and I'm aware from Luke that this is sociologically the opposite of how sociologists view things. That we talk about it, I talk about it on a micro level and a macro level. So basically, culture is everything. Okay, it's every practice, but within schools, it's the arts. So on a micro level, the kind of transmission of culture is the transmission of the arts and what version of the arts we transmit to young people. On a macro level, it's basically every social practice that we do. So our food is a culture, the way that we dress is a culture, the way that we hold ourselves, whether we are polite or whether we swear, that's cultural. So yeah, I remember having an argument with a lecturer who destroyed me when I was young, and he said that everything is political, and I couldn't accept that at the time. But yes, he was right. Everything is political, and culture is by nature massively political.
Okay, but before we go any further on that side of it, the political side, can we just clear up this one thing here? Are you just talking about the arts in schools? Is that the main focus of the book, is the arts, or is science a culture? Are the sciences part of this or not?
I do kind of glance on that, by I put a list of cultural forms, and of course that does include science, and it includes psychology. Yes, science is culture, but the focus of the book is on arts provision. So the conclusions of the book are related to what view of culture at the end should we be inculcating in young people, and how might we alter or adapt the arts curriculum so that, one, we can actually fulfill what Ofsted want, but we can fulfill it in a way that is not a symbolically violent act, whereby we're just taking the culture off the kids and replacing it with an allegedly superior culture, which is actually the possession of the tradition of a ruling class.
Okay, so and again, to clear up the thing about the arts, you're an English teacher.
Yes.
Does English language teaching, English literature teaching become part of this? Is history, the humanities, part of this?
Right, Martin, I'll kind of have to stick to areas of expertise, really. Yes, of course, how we teach history is profoundly politically important, but there are experts in that, and that's not me. In terms of the provision of what we provide for children as what is appropriate literature for them to be reading in schools, yes, I would have that within the arts curriculum.
Okay, so as an English teacher, I would question the idea of being symbolically violent myself, but I understand the thing underneath it, which you're saying there, which is saying this is your culture, it's all wrong, here's the proper culture, have this, and that can be quite a violent act. I think that's the way you're using it there.
Well, I think I think what's happening in education at the moment is that what we're replacing certain students' culture with this idea, which I'm very anti, which is the idea of being disadvantaged. So we're not saying that the white working class kid has a culture that's of any value. We're saying he is disadvantaged, and the advantages are to be found according to the current establishment. The advantages are to be found, and I'm not disputing this, that there are advantages to be found in the inculcation or the handing over of a different tradition, a tradition different to the tradition that the child's culture is used to. And it is by nature, by implying that somebody's own culture is valueless and giving them access to a culture that you imply has more value, it is by nature a symbolically violent act.
Yeah. So does a child have a qualitatively good education outside of school? I mean, is there much purpose in going to school, in other words? I mean, what is the role of school to introduce them to? If it's not their culture, then it's whose culture?
Right. Well, I think we glance here upon Michael Young's idea of powerful knowledge. Now, Michael Young has been used by establishment forces to argue for this kind of the knowledge-led school. And actually, powerful knowledge is probably a bit more sophisticated and complex than that. I absolutely agree with Michael Young that there are things that you have to get at school that you can only get at school, that you won't get at home. However, the assertion, the kind of covert assertion that a certain strata of culture is superior to other strands of culture is, for me, in this kind of Arnoldian sense of culture that we're inculcating at the moment, is for me a deliberate act to replace one thing with another. And there are forms of working class culture that are valuable. And the intention of actually introducing a legitimate culture to kids is, I believe, and I had an epiphany about this two weekends ago, to destroy popular culture. And by popular culture, I don't mean sugary pop hits. By popular culture, I mean trade unionism. I mean affiliations to organizations that seek to improve equality of opportunity and outcomes. So the assertion of this kind of canonical culture is a distraction technique to distract people away from things that will improve their lives.
It's a fascinating interview, Martin, and I'm looking forward to hearing the full interview that you did with Phil, and I think that's going to be released later in the week. Those of you that have subscribed will receive a notification of when we release that full interview. But he said some really interesting things there, and I was particularly struck at the end by the idea that popular culture might in some way include trade unionism. That's an interesting idea, Martin.
Well, I think part of it is saying what popular culture might be is not necessarily all about sugary pop music and things like that, but also the culture that's been put together by the masses, whatever they're, the working class, as it used to be known as. I think his next book is about the white working class, so he's got a particular interest in culture from a class perspective, as I think he made quite clear in that interview. But it's certainly a contrast to perhaps some of the other interviews we've had so far, including Hirsch last week.
Yes, and I think that when people listen to the full interview, I mean, one interesting point is we got a hint of it there, where he was addressing Michael Young and saying that it's absolutely right. He accepts the fact that in order to get certain kinds of knowledge, you have to go to school. That school is where you get that stuff. And I wonder to what extent, maybe, you've spoken to Phil more about this than I have, but maybe is there a binary being set up here which doesn't necessarily have to exist, that we can go to school and receive powerful knowledge and not feel that our own interests in our community are being eroded or destroyed?
Well, it's an interesting point there, because there's a
we need to go from me to you.
Yeah. It'd be nice if I was there. But anyway, hello.
Samantha, what are you doing, Samantha?
It would be interesting to make a correlation, because we were talking about rhetoric being taught just now in the part of the leadership program and the curriculum. And Phil himself is teaching rhetoric as part of a Saturday school to children as well. So perhaps there are a lot of similarities between what people think should be taught, and perhaps it's a conversation that can be had across the divide. But I think there are lots of other things perhaps to be talked about. Authoritarianism. I noticed the book in the background there is slightly different perhaps than the Tom Bennett behavior program. I think he's had the Paul Dix one there that he was clearly putting into the space to make a point, I think.
Yeah, you might have noticed in an interview Tom Bennett did, he had that book in his background as well. I was interested to get the history about the idea of the fascist painting, and that he's not actually saying that that particular painting is necessarily fascist, which comes as a bit of a relief to hear that.
Well, yeah, it's interesting though, and this is something I was pressing him on through in the interview. Is how much does culture belong to people, and how much of it can move around? Is there such a thing as a working class culture? Is there such a thing as a middle class culture? Is Shakespeare belonging to one or the other? Or are there things that can be liked by anyone?
It's a really fascinating debate. I read over the summer the latest book by James Shapiro, Shakespeare and a Divine in America. And one of the things that he relays in that book is that in the 1880s, he's talking about these riots in New York where a new theatre was built, which only admitted the elite, and the common people led an assault against that theatre because they wanted greater access to Shakespeare. Although there were 5 or 6 theatres putting on Shakespeare plays on the same nights, the idea that there was one theatre that they couldn't access Shakespeare was beyond the pale, and which is rather sort of wonderful, and to imagine that people would feel so passionate about Shakespeare. And also the other thing that I was struck listening to Phil, especially when he was talking about initially about the fact that culture isn't a redeeming. It doesn't redeem us from the potential for evil, and he was using the idea that Hitler was a competent watercolorist, and this was a debate that was raging in the sort of late 50s and 60s, and certainly George Steiner addressing, particularly sort of thinking about people like Leavis and his idea that sort of culture would sort of redeem people. Steiner in particular, and I've got a quote here, which is one of my favorite Steiner quotes, is that a man can read Goethe or Rilke in the evening and can play Bach or Schubert and go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning. And that whole period really illuminated the idea that being good, being compassionate, being virtuous and being cultured are clearly not the same thing at all.
Absolutely, or else we'd have an elite of moral leaders who are writers and composers, etc., etc. And of course, the arts don't necessarily bring about the best in people.
No, we can only hope for more leaders like Václav Havel, maybe.
Well, perhaps. Shall we move on?
But move on. Where are we going next, Martin?
Well, we're going to COVID land, aren't we? Our COVID update.
We are. It's COVID update time, and you've got another graph to show us.
I do. I've got a little graph here because Chris Whitty put this up. I think it was Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance during the week, and the government. What's it called? A press conference with him.
One of those, yeah.
And yeah, the 3 of them were there. And if we look at that graph, and it's now disappeared just as I was about to, we can look at the bottom 3 lines there, and that's very much school-age children there, and a very slight increase, if anything at all, not very significant increase in the amount of positivity or test positivity. No. And then you can see from 17 to 18 and then 19 to 21 there, and more of an increase there. So, I mean, basically schools seem to be doing a good job. Professor Russell Viner has said the evidence suggests that transmission in schools is very limited, even in secondary schools. It is likely much of the transmission among groups of young people maybe outside of the school settings, as we really have little evidence of transmission within schools. So that's probably good news, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there are rises in school-age children, but this, I mean, one of the other things that we were going to have a bit of a chat about, you mentioned this at the beginning of the show, was the article in The Guardian by Simon Jenkins. And one of the statistics he cites in his article is that 1 in 6 secondary schools are not fully open. How do we account for that, Martin?
I've got no idea where he gets that figure from. I mean, what do you mean by not fully open as well? I mean, this
exactly. So the whole principle of putting students into these bubbles is so that schools can remain open. And we've, in the same week, we've also, schools have been hit by the it looks like there's going to be legislation which says that if schools are not providing video lessons by some point in October, I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, then they will be breaking the law. And obviously, lots of people on social media are getting quite aerated about that and sort of basically making the point that we can do that, but it will mean that we're not able to do other things. And what are your priorities?
Yeah, and do you want to teach a lesson with a video camera pointing at you? It's quite difficult for a drama teacher, perhaps, that. But interestingly, Oak have almost 250,000 unique users since the beginning of school. So Oak National.
Oh, I don't know if Martin's disappeared there or if it's me, but I'm going to assume it's Martin. It is Martin, right? So I think, yeah, Martin, we've got, so the Oak National have seen a jump from 121,000 to 249,000 unique users between September the 7th and September the 21st. And that's obviously something to do with the number of children who are at home, self-isolating. There are, of course, some schools who have had to isolate entire bubbles. But that we always knew this was going to be the case. We always knew that this time of year was going to be stern and testing. And for all of those schools who feel this under this enormous pressure to be teaching live lessons or video lessons, the fact that Oak Academy is there is hopefully going to come as something of a relief, and that they're not, and we're not going to have each individual school or each individual trust reinventing that particular wheel in order to comply with legislation. It should be, maybe I'm being naive here, it should be something which is relatively straightforward, but let's hope so. If I'm wrong about something, I'd rather not be wrong on. So we were also going, have we got Martin back? Not yet. Okay, so before we were going to have a chat about the Simon Jenkins article, but let's give Martin an opportunity to sort out his internet connection. We were gonna try and transition much more neatly to an interview that I did in the week with Sarah Dove on mental well-being and mental health and behaviour in schools and those sorts of things. So let's have that interview now and see if we can get Martin back. Well, I'm thrilled to have Sarah Dove here joining us today. And she's going, Sarah, I mean, you're going to tell us a little bit about what you do and your background, but essentially we're going to talk a little bit about children's mental health and how that might have been affected by the pandemic. But can you just start, for those that don't know you, Sarah, tell us a little bit about your day job, what you get up to.
So in terms of my day job, I've been working with children who are vulnerable to exclusion for the last 18, 19 years. And when I talk about exclusion, I mean children that might be permanently excluded. They might have difficulties in their social situations or their family situations, but also children that might be excluded because of their medical needs that make it difficult for them to attend school. That could be things like life-limiting, life-threatening conditions such as cancer, or equally it could be things like psychiatric needs such as anxiety, depression, psychosis, and so on.
Right, so
and in terms of what I do every day, it's quite varied. So I do a lot of work with local authorities about how to promote inclusion within their schools.
Right. And am I right in thinking, Sarah, you also do some work with within alternative provision sites?
Yep, so I am the president of the national organisation PRUSAP, which represents PRUs and APs nationally, but I also do direct work with pupil referral units and AP, so things around looking at behaviour, looking at the systems, how to improve the experiences for teachers and the young people to make sure it's a safe place. But my bread and butter work before I was made redundant and became a consultant was teaching in pupil referral units and being a head teacher in a PRU.
Right. So it would be fair to say quite a lot of experience with children at the margins of education. And, you know, that being the case, I know that one of the things that you've been doing over recent months is doing a mental health chat. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so as there was increasing lockdowns across Britain, we became more aware that children were struggling with the ill effects of lockdown, essentially. So the change in routines for some children, for some they might have been experiencing domestic violence, for others it might have been a concern and fear about returning to school. We wanted to do something practical to help children, but also parents and education practitioners as well. So we started a Kids COVID mental health chat. It's quite well attended by clinicians, teachers, sometimes children themselves and parents. And really we explored different issues around children's mental health relating to COVID. So some of that has been around the return to school, about establishing routines for that children. For some, it's because actually they have already have mental health difficulties and it's been either exacerbated by COVID in terms of isolation, or alternatively, actually, they've had bigger barriers in returning to school, and how is that managed? And that's a great conversation that we have. And it's just on Twitter. It's very informal and we pose different questions and we share practice, essentially.
And what's the hashtag for that, Sarah?
It's Kids COVID MH.
Kids COVID MH. And is it Tuesday night?
It's a Tuesday night between 8 and 9 p.m.
Right. So if you want to join in with Kids COVID MH, mental health chat, tune in to Twitter at that time and take part in that conversation. So, Sarah, so one of the things which I happen to know is that you've got a book that's going to be released next year, and on managing behaviour in the classroom. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and the sorts of messages that you put forward in it?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm just going to sort of correct a little bit around managing behaviour. It's more around understanding behaviour and not just about noticing it, but looking at real strategies to support children's engagement in class and around the school. So we look at a wide range of different issues, and we have what's called an XY axis. So, for example, rather than just saying a child has poor behaviour, what we look at is more of, is that behaviour consistently poor, and what does that poor mean? What do we notice? What do we see? And could there be underlying issues relating to that? We want to move away from this idea that all behaviour is communication. Yes, of course it is. Children are telling us something by the way that they behave, but how do we provide real strategies for those children? And throughout the book, there's a series of, I call them case studies, but actually it's children's stories of children that I've worked with. So I've had the joy of working in psychiatric inpatient services and hospital schools, as well as mainstream and alternative provision. And it's children that have kind of showcased some of their difficulties and how we might support those children. But whilst it's looking at nurturing behaviours that we want to see in the classroom and how we might understand them better, there's also a chapter around teachers' mental health. And actually, when things are really difficult and things don't go as planned, how can we support ourselves as well? And that comes from my own lived experience of I attempted to kill myself. This is a bit dark, really, isn't it? 4 years ago. And it talks a little bit about that and how your mental health is incredibly important as well as young people. Right.
So there's a real sort of in the trenches feel, both for someone who has struggled with your own mental health and from the perspective of working with children. What would you say your book has to offer for teachers working in comprehensive schools, not mainstream schools? What will they get from reading it?
So the children that I talk about have existed and do exist within mainstream schools. So it's children that might have come through their exclusion, as well as children that I've met within mainstream. And the idea is that they can pick out different things and try and think about things differently. One of the most powerful things that I had someone say to me is you can get really stuck around a child's behaviour. It becomes incredibly frustrating if children aren't responding in the way that you would like. So what I hope that this book offers is a way of thinking differently about things that we may have got stuck and got into a routine of trying to deal with it on our own, but actually seeing the child as part of a wider system within the school culture, within the system of parents, family, and the community. And I would say these children, whilst at the margins of education, actually children are part of our community, and they are all our responsibility.
Right. Okay. So I'm interested in one of the things that you said there, and obviously I haven't read the book yet. It's not out yet. I'm looking forward to having a crack at it. But you said there you're trying to move away from the idea that behaviour is communication. Why do you think that's not a particularly helpful message?
I think it's become a cliche which tells us very little about the child and very little about their story. So,
Right.
And I think any broad brush response means that we aren't really understanding the child. And I think it's that, yes, behaviour is communication. I'm not saying it's not, but it's also part of a system. It's not just a child expressing their thoughts and feelings. It's also an expression of the society they're in, the system they're in, the culture they're in, and so on. And I just think when you say that, I think there's always the worry that it reduces it to not having to deal with it. Oh, they're just trying to tell us they're upset, or they're just trying to tell us there is trauma, or just that, and then we ignore it and don't look at ways of supporting that child to be able to express their needs in a different way. And I think always with cliches, whether or not the cliche is zero tolerance or a restorative practice or whatever it might be, that when we have a catch-all phrase and situation, I think it does little to really unpick some of the difficulties that child has, or that school might have, or that family might have, because I don't want to problematize the child either. I think the child is often has a whole range of different things happening around them.
One of the things, this is something, it's just like a personal bête noire for me, and I thought maybe I'd ask you about it whilst I'm here, is that all the time, one of the themes that seems to be really consistent in reporting on schools and the media is that there seems to be a common pattern where a school has really, really struggled. Perhaps it's gone into special measures. It's been brokered into a trust. The trust has come along and tried to raise standards, and they put in strict policies in order to make that possible for learning to happen. There's a disgruntled parent who gets in touch with the newspaper, and all of a sudden it's a story about how horrible the school is. And it always strikes me as, why don't newspapers, for instance, why don't parents get in touch with schools and go, gosh, some of these places are chaotic and it's really horrible for my child to be there. Why do we always report on schools, negatively on schools that are trying to make a calmer, more orderly environment? What's your take on that?
I think it goes back to the idea that you're more likely to complain than you are to offer compliments, aren't you? I don't think it's any different from school or otherwise. I take it from the starting point that as a parent, my job is to represent my child.
Yeah.
So I always, when I get disgruntled parents, I have a lot of disgruntled parents, but my view is that's their job. Their job is to protect their child. And if they're doing that in whatever means they think's helpful, then that's great. But then I suppose you need to look at the school as being part of the community and what has become problematic for them to make sure that all children and all parents' voices feel valued. And there's also the aspect of some children don't respond very well to blanket rules, for example, because so if I were to give my daughter as an example, and it's one that Tom uses as well. I've got Tourette syndrome, and my daughter, she started to tick and make lots of noises. She's really loud, and there's blanket rules around talking, for example, in her school. In class at certain things, and she takes that blanket rule because she's very literal, as if I tick or make a noise, then I'm going to get in trouble. Now then there's the bit of, or actually you need to speak to your teachers, you need to explain, and they will be absolutely fine, and of course they're absolutely fine, but how people internalize those rules and understand them may be different to someone else. So my daughter catastrophizes. Other children would go, well, clearly I've got Tourette's or I've got tics and the teacher's not going to mind, or, you know, I've broken my foot and I have to wear trainers, but I've got a note from my mum and it's all right. But some people don't internalize rules in that way, and they panic and they get worried about what it means for them. Or, you know, no mobile phones, but a child's diabetes blood sugar is on their mobile phone on an app. Now, again, a school is generally going to be responsive to that. But sometimes if people aren't confident about having those conversations, or when they do open up those conversations, it's not met with a sensible approach, then I think that can be difficult.
No, that's a really interesting point. Not something I'd thought about before. Well, there you are, Martin. So lots of food for thought there about how we should be thinking about those more marginalised children and their families within the education system.
There we go. Look, we're coming right to the end of the show. And speaking as an ex-marginalised child myself, I think we ought to get on with the raffle here. Let's move.
Well, we will get on with the raffle, but we definitely want to hear about your marginalisation in the future.
No, you don't.
And if not, I'll tell you about mine. Right, yeah, let's remind ourselves we've got a truly ugly graphic to put up with the details of the raffle. Samantha, cue the graphic. There we are. How disgusting is that? Apologies, it will be. We won't ever use that again. And so, which should we do first, Martin? Ed or Hirsch or Mary?
Let's go for Mary's first, shall we?
Okay. Who have you got? And by the way, quick reminder: you must subscribe to the channel to be eligible for the draw.
That's right. So subscribe. And for next week, I think you win Phil Beadle's book. But here we have Jude Hunton.
Jude, congratulations. Copy of Mary Myatt's Back on Track on the way to you. All you need to do is get in touch. We'll put the email address up and get in touch with us with your address, and we'll send you a copy of Mary's book.
And let's have a go. Have a look. Sorry, I make it look over so I'm not looking in. So I Carl Hendrick again. This is for the E.D. Hirsch book, and it's Jenny Davis. Jenny,
wonderful, great, Jenny. Get in touch with us, Jenny Davis. Samantha, can you put the email address up so that people know where to get in touch with us? Can we do that? We can't put it up, but it's hello@wastingyourtime.co.uk. So Jenny, Jude, get in touch with us. And we should say we still haven't heard from Carl Hendrick. He's won copies of 2 books now. I think he won a copy of Symbiosis, didn't he? And what was the other one?
He definitely should get in touch. And please, if you've liked any of our material, or please hit the like button. And there's loads of things to see on our site now. We've got quite a few videos out there, including the unexpurgated interviews. So look at those and subscribe and hit those like buttons.
And of course, during the week, we'll release the full length uncut videos of the interviews that you saw a glimpse of. So we will be doing a special, one of those special premiere things like we did with the E.D. Hirsch video for Phil's video. So if you're really excited about getting into the meat of that, then subscribe. But for this week, thank you very much. It's been your time you've been wasting.
And thanks for wasting it with us.
Thank you. And we're done.